Again, so the FSA, in this case the Food Standards Agency, was made aware of the situation, and once again they attempted a cover-up. The article says the FSA set up in the wake of the BSE crisis. Remember, they're always set up in the wake of a crisis.
The mad cow disease crisis.
Yes. They kept secret test results showing the banned drug bute in meat from horses slaughtered in the UK last year until after a whistleblower had leaked them. So they were set up to deal with the mad cow disease, which again, everybody kept on saying, eat the beef, it's okay. There was that minister, the environment minister, who fed a hamburger to his child. And then
he was a honky. Some honky fed that tainted beef to his kid. That's what honkies do. So you know what goes good with this beef lasagna is some nice crackers. You know, some crackers on the side of your honky beef lasagna. You make it, you know, beautiful.
So this week, it waited a whole day before telling the public. In a brief press release slapped on its website but not sent out to journalists, that frozen beef and ready meals contain staggering levels of undeclared horse meat. And again, this is exactly what the U.S. does. The late Friday afternoon press releases of, oh, by the way, there's no financial system, and oh, yeah, we're going to give them $700 billion. Go out shopping. So let's move on to the next layer of this horse meat scandal here in the UK and across Europe, actually. And let's see how it also relates to the financial crisis, the same sort of misbehavior, the same sort of crime, and we're calling it a crime in the horse meat scandal. Horse meat scandal blamed on international fraud by mafia gangs. There are claims that vets and other officials working within abattoirs and food production plants are intimidated into signing off meat as beef when it is in fact cheaper alternatives such as pork or horse. Now, doesn't this sound like what happens to the rating agencies and the auditors who bless the books of these banks and their CDOs and the raters who give those CDO packages an AAA rating?
Well, there's 4 big abattoirs here in the City of London. There's Lloyd's, Royal Bank of Scotland, HSBC, and the other one I can't remember, Barclays.
RBS?
Yeah, they're the 4 financial abattoirs or slaughterhouses. And they are basically slaughtering the economy, paying themselves huge fees to slaughter the economy, to fill the financial products, the securitization, the derivatives, with substitution of junk bonds, which are collateralized by nothing, which are kept afloat by the Bank of England, now from Mark Carney, who is, you know, should be in a circus sideshow, as any Carney should be. That was an appropriate name for Mark Carney. He's a Carney Barkman.
Well, he's also a carnivore, right, for the horse meat that is in maybe some of these collateralized debt obligations. They should have done a swap between the mortgage-backed securities and this lasagna. Now, finally on this, of course, again, comparing it to the financial crisis, because who is the biggest derivatives wielder in the world? That's JP Morgan. So it makes sense that, of course, they're going to be somewhere on this chain of food fraud. Horse meat scandal, the polo player linked to Findus. There's some photos of here Lyndon Lee, the boss of the private equity firm linked to Findus, is a financier straight out of Central Casting. Yes, because he's ex-Goldman Sachs. He's riding around on a horse. They don't say whether he sold his horse to one of these lasagnas. I would expect maybe it would be like, you know, a AAA lasagna ready meal. But they end with, following a restructuring last September, Lion Capital's stake, this is his private equity firm, and Findus was watered down, no pun intended, I guess, to less than a third, with hedge funds, Highbridge Capital, JP Morgan, and Northwest Mutual buying into the company.
Yeah, well, I think they're going to remake Sweeney Todd with Jamie Dimon as Sweeney Todd, where he's slicing and dicing his customers and feeding them into the lasagna burgers.
At least their wealth, of course.
He's a honky for sure. All right, Stacey Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Rex.
Stay tuned for the second half. We'll be speaking to David Graeber, author of Debt, The First 5,000 Years. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to anthropologist David Graeber, author of Debt, The First 5,000 Years. David Graeber, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, David Graeber, all the talk is of global currency war, from money printing to devaluations to gold repatriation. But was it the collapse of the debt markets that happened first? Is the debt-based fiat system falling apart?
Yeah, I would say it is. I think that we're at a point where people are coasting along because it's the only thing they know how to do, and basically a lot of them don't care if the whole thing falls apart. That's why 2008 happened to begin with. But I get the impression that there's maybe 5–10% of the people running things who actually care about the long-term viability of the system, and when I talk to these guys, they're freaking out. I mean, they realize they're about to hit 3 different walls at the same time.
Explain more. What 3 different walls?
Well, I mean, there's the debt overhang, there's the ecological collapse, there's a whole series of obviously not viable long-term patterns going on.
And that's been the case for a number of years. And why?
Yeah.
What's the trigger now? Is it... first of all, going back to the book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, which is a great book, which came first, money or debt?
Well, it depends on how you define it. But I mean, a debt in the sense of like, I owe you one. An obligation, that's always existed.
Right, so credit, in other words, in the book they talk about credit kind of came first. In other words, people would say, I owe you, let's do this, and I owe you something
or
in the
they
future.
say, here, I'll give you a gift, but really, you owe them something.
And they kind of invented money to extinguish the debts.
As a way of, because normally you don't want to extinguish the debts, because if somebody gives you something, you give them something back exactly the same. It's like saying, I don't want to know you anymore.
Now, over the course of the many millennia, the concept of debt jubilee has been big. Occasionally the debts get so big. And going back to medieval times, the debts were seen, or debt forgiveness were seen as a way to prevent the population from getting in bed with their competing rulers.
That's
competing
right.
rulers, the aristocracy. It wasn't that of
essentially being enslaved and everybody ending up some flunky, So kings wouldn't really like that, because then the barons would take over.
So what about a modern day debt jubilee? Where are we in that? Because it looks as though if they're hitting all these walls simultaneously, someone's going to pop up and say, you know what, maybe we need to just do a debt forgiveness.
Absolutely, and it's really remarkable the degree to which they're starting to talk about it. Like 2 years ago, it would have been completely insane to suggest debt forgiveness. Now, as I say, those people actually care about the long-term viability of the system. They're starting to talk about it. And I think it's inevitable. Some kind of mass debt forgiveness has to happen. The real struggle right now, I think, is how they're going to dress it up, whether they're going to be honest about what they're doing or figure out some way to finagle it so they can claim it's not true, because they want to keep that idea that at least poor people really do have to pay their debts. And, I mean, rich people don't, obviously. But, whether it's going to be used as a way of reproducing the same system, the same ridiculous unequal power structures, or whether ordinary people are going to finally have some say in what the economy looks like, and we're going to transform to something more sane. I mean, that's what it is. What form is the debt forgiveness going to take? Well,
let's look at an institution like the Federal Reserve Bank in Washington, D.C. They, during this crisis, have expanded their balance sheet from $800 billion to over $3 trillion, but they're leveraged 50 to 1. So less than 2% of this $3 trillion or so is something that has any market value. The rest is just an accounting figure that suggests a market value under certain conditions. Is there ever been in history a time when the global banking system has been leveraged to such a degree where there is so little there's so little collateral backing up these institutions?
Generally speaking, in the past, you'd have temples full of gold, some kind of material thing, and then all sorts of people doing credit on the basis of that. I mean, it is true that, like, the Fed does have most of the world's gold reserves there, but it's really just a symbol. No, it's made up. I mean, I think most of that Fed money is just, it's an accounting figure for a way of just giving money to the banks, which is what the government policy has been since 2008. You lend them, you print money, you lend it to them at incredibly low rate of interest, and then you let them put it back in the Fed and lend it back to you again at a slightly higher rate of interest. So, the numbers are meaningless. It's just a way of just flat out giving money to rich people.
Well, you mentioned about central banks and gold. There's about 160,000 tons of gold above ground. Approximately a third is owned by central banks. The rest is owned by out there in the population. For example, the population of India owns 20,000 tons of gold. And it's owned in jewelry, and it's owned in other store houses, and the public now is increasingly buying gold. But there seems to be a scramble now. Central banks, particularly Russia, who has been the biggest buyer of gold, really. China's buying gold aggressively. Repatriation of gold by Germany. How do you interpret that?
I don't know. I think people are sort of trying to hedge their bets in as many ways as possible because they know the system's going to collapse, so it only seems natural to grab on something you think might be of enduring value.
Well, Russia's